Welcome to the Catalyst Sale podcast. This is a special in a series that we're putting out specifically related to topics that I think everybody is thinking about today as we make a transition from working in offices to potentially working at home. I have Dr. Erin Weiss on with me today. She's a clinical psychologist in Houston, Texas, level 2 certified in Team CBT. Erin, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So what does Team CBT have to do with empathy?
That's a great question. So Team CBT is an approach to CBT. It was developed by Dr. David Burns at Stanford University, and TEAM is an acronym. So the T is for testing, the E is for empathy. So it's a very empathy-based form of therapy. And then I won't go into all of the rest of it, I guess, to keep this brief, but it's a form of therapy that really is very heavily focused on empathy. And empathy is a tool that can be taught. So how to be more empathic when you're working with people.
Awesome. So how do you define empathy, or how do we define empathy?
Empathy is the being able to see something from another person's perspective. So not like how you would feel if you were in their shoes, and not necessarily feeling the way they feel, which I think is actually a common mistake people make with empathy, is thinking that they have to take on the other person's feelings themselves, which can be really exhausting, or putting themselves in that person's shoes, which may be not accurate. But just trying to really understand from their perspective what their position is, even if you don't agree with it.
And so you'd mentioned one common mistake. What are some other common mistakes that people make when thinking about, or even practicing empathy?
I think people often assume that they know what another person is thinking or feeling because of kind of their own lens of what they would, how they think they would feel in that situation. So a lot of times people think they're being empathic and they're really not. And it's something people have a really hard time getting feedback on. They don't want to hear that they're not being empathic. But if you're really you're open to that feedback that you're not getting it right. So I think that that's another common mistake, is just making assumptions like,
Awesome. So how can we overcome those biases, or how can we overcome those challenges, or even be more aware that those challenges are happening?
I think that approaching empathy in the more systematic way is really helpful with that, and making sure that you're open to hearing what the other person has to say is really key. So there's 5 steps that we teach in Team CBT for empathy. The first one is called not really steps, because they don't have to go in order. Let me say that. Okay. They're just pieces kind of to the puzzle. But one is called disarming. So that's finding some truth in what the other person is saying, even if you can't agree with what they're saying as a whole, but finding some piece of truth in what they're saying to you. Then there's what we call thought and feeling empathy. And basically that just means kind of saying back to them the same words that they've said to you, and maybe making a guess at how they're feeling if they haven't told you, which most people don't. A lot of times you have to guess that based on like tone or body language or things like that. And then finding out, is that accurate? So did I get that right? Have I missed anything here? Or even, how close am I to getting what you're saying? Mm-hmm. What am I missing? That questioning is called inquiry. So that's one of the steps as well. Inquiry isn't about like, how do we fix this? It's about, do I have that right? What am I missing? How has that felt for you? Tell me more. So really hearing from their perspective instead of making an assumption that you already know. Then there is I feel statements. So this is where you get to kind of share your piece, but using feeling words. Mm-hmm. So again, not acting out with your tone or your body language or passive aggressiveness, or the need to be right. There's so many mistakes that we all tend to make in empathy, but just saying, I feel this way about it. Maybe I'm feeling angry, and that's okay if you're saying it in a respectful kind of a way where you're like, I'm angry and I want you to know because I want us to work this out. I don't want this to be a problem between us. The fifth piece is they call it stroking, just for lack of a better word, but basically it's like striking the other person's ego, speaking with respect, kindness, showing that you really care about them and want to make things better. So a positive regard. So those are the 5 pieces that we would want to see incorporated when we're really responding with empathy to someone else.
Awesome. How does this change? If you think about like a lot of what you just described there, so disarming thought and feeling, inquiry, I feel statements, stroking, it seems like these are things that we could do whether you're in an environment where you're looking at someone directly or an environment where you're talking on the phone. Imagine one might be more difficult than the other. But as people are making this transition where they're starting to think about managing teams or managing customer interaction or managing themselves when they're at home, what should they keep in mind, or how does this change now as people start to transition into a work from home mentality or approach?
Sure. So I think you're right. It is easier for one than the other. Video is by far easier to still do this and have like a real connection with. Actually just transitioned to doing all of my sessions by video this week for the first time. But I was surprised to find how I didn't feel like it was really impacting, and I didn't get any negative feedback from my patients either, as far as their ability to feel heard and to connect with video. So I think that with video, you can still see body language and things like that are often cues to how someone might be feeling. You can still do it on the phone, but I think you're going to probably need a lot more inquiry because there's a lot of information missing that you might be able to get kind of clues from to put out more guesses if it's video, especially in terms of how someone else might be feeling. And that's really important, is to understand, like, if someone's mad at you or disagreeing with you, you need that information to really get where they're coming from. So I think a lot more inquiry is going to be needed if you're on a phone call.
And how does this change when you start to think about it from the perspective of maybe engaging with customers, those people outside of your organization, team members, those people inside your organization, or even thinking about it in managing yourself?
Sure. So I think when you're dealing with people, and this is a work from home thing too that I should have added, it's more isolating when you're working from home, right? So it's easy to just get stuck in your own world, your own mindset, what's happening for you, and to kind of make assumptions about what's happening for everybody else. So I think that there's a lot more need for having these conversations that are based in these skills, because you're not just kind of in the presence of other people. It's harder to stay connected without that. When you're talking about your team, you probably want to be talking to them, making sure you're having meetings more often, checking in again, see how are people doing? Tell me about what's going on for you. How are you handling this? Maybe share some of your own stories in a way that's appropriate and not crossing any kind of professional boundaries, but making sure that you're having those conversations probably more often. And with customers, I think there's a big change in how things are happening, I'm assuming, based on, I'm not a salesperson. I live with a salesperson. I read the news. I know that, buying patterns, hiring patterns, all of these business things, they're not the same right now. And so having an understanding of kind of the context of what's happening and being understanding about that with people, not being is pushy, maybe, is you might be under other circumstances, kind of giving them the space, just showing them that you care about them as people, that you want to stay connected even if they're not buying right now. Is there anything you can do to be helpful at this time? So that you have those relationships that maybe down the road when things turn around and change again, that relationship is there and they may think about you when they're looking to actually buy something.
And as you're going through this, what comes to mind for me is just realize that people are human beings. Like we're all kind of dealing and processing all of this in our own way. In some ways that might be similar to others. In some ways it might be completely different, but we're all kind of going through this same thing in the context of space and time. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially right now with social distancing and keeping our distance from people, we really need to be mindful of keeping that connection and recognizing we're all in this together. Like, even though we're having to stay physically separate from each other, we are all globally in this same situation. And that can be a point of connection and understanding across people. And I think avoidance breeds fear. And so we have to be really mindful to not let the fact that we're having to be physically avoiding people create an us versus them fear-based mentality. So, yeah.
Awesome. Erin, is there anything else that folks who are listening to this as they engage in this conversation should be thinking about relative to empathy and the transitions that are happening in both in work and at home?
Well, I think, we talked about team and customer. We didn't talk about self. And I think family is also an important one. If for anyone who's working from home now, that's going to be who has a family or other people that they're living with, it's going to be a big shift in how things run in the household as well. So I think those are things to keep in mind too. In terms of empathy for ourselves, that falls more under like self-compassion, understanding that there are factors going on that are going to be impacting everyone, not beating yourself up too much when things don't go the way they usually do, not taking it as something that's personal to you, but understanding that, there's a lot of factors at play, and having some patience and kindness towards yourself. And then also understanding that, this is going to be disrupting everybody in the household's life, right? So I know when you're working from home and you want to be focused on work and making sure that you're getting your work done, and everybody needing to be really understanding and respectful of your workspace. I get that. I'm experiencing that to a certain extent myself right now. It's challenging. But also knowing like everyone else in your house is also having their whole life turned upside down and disrupted. And you're being there, if you're not usually, is disrupting their routine. Kids being at home when they're not used to being is disrupting their routine. Everybody's routine is disrupted right now, and trying to understand that perspective for them as well, that, we're all going through something. Have those conversations. How are you doing? What is this like for you? Here's what it's like for me. How can we work together to make this as painless as possible? And even, one of the things we're doing is trying to find ways to make it fun for our son as much as possible, so that, he's not here feeling afraid, even though, there's still some of that comes up. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll all make it through this together. We'll figure out a way as we move forward. As we wrap up here, are there any resources that you would point folks to, or any recommendations that you have, whether could be book content, it could be video content, could be just websites to look at? Is there anything that you would recommend or places you'd point folks to? And I do know that your husband, David, and you were on a podcast recently. We'll include a link in the show notes to that, so people can hear more about some of the impact in general leadership. And I know that predated a lot of what we've got going on right now. But is there any place
Good, yeah.
else that you would suggest that people go to, or resources that they go to?
Yeah, so as far as empathy specifically, Dr. Burns, who I mentioned, was the person who created the Team CBT, and kind of set those steps out. He has a podcast that's called the Feeling Good Podcast, and he's got several that are on empathy, and they're the 5 skills of effective communication. So that's what it would be labeled under there. He also has a book called Feeling Good Together. Cheesy name, but it's very much, again, focused on those steps that I just talked about, the 5 secrets, and kind of gives some practice examples. And they're not all, it sounds like a couples therapy book, but it's not. Some of the examples he gives are workplace related as well in the book. As far as self-compassion, Kristen Neff is one of the lead researchers on that. I think she's at UT Austin, and she's got a website with lots of great resources on it as well. I don't know the website off the top of my head, but I'm imagining you can find these things pretty easily. So those would be kind of my top resources for what we've talked about today.
Perfect. And we'll include links in the show notes. Erin, thank you very much for joining the podcast today, and I really appreciate the interaction. Folks, if you want to hear more and you'd like to go deeper into this conversation with Dr. Weiss, I'm happy to have her back on. We wanted to put a series like this together so folks could have some practical things that they can be thinking about as they make these transitions. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.